Rooted the first time I met Hassan Osman. He was losing a case he had 3 days to win. I wasn't supposed to be in his office. I'd gotten the address wrong, walked into the wrong building, climbed 3 flights of stairs to what I thought was the community organizing nonprofit that was helping fight the land seizure. Instead, I found myself in a tiny law office with water-stained ceiling tiles and a man in a wrinkled shirt screaming at a document like it had personally betrayed him. They're claiming adverse possession, he was saying to nobody in particular, running his hand through his hair, claiming the city owns the land because nobody's filed proper documentation for 7 years. It's bullshit. It's legally bullshit. But it's the kind of bullshit that stands up in Texas courts if we can't prove otherwise by Friday. He looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, completely lost and holding a stack of gardening permits I'd brought to show the wrong nonprofit. "Can I help you?" he asked. And his accent was East African underneath the Austin grown-up, and his eyes were tired in a way that suggested he hadn't slept in 3 days. "I'm looking for the community organizing office," I said, "but I think I can help you with that." He laughed like I'd made a joke. Then he realized I was serious. "My name is Diego Morales. I'm 26, Ecuadorian American, born in Austin to parents who'd escaped political violence in Quito with nothing but the knowledge of how to grow food. My parents taught me that land means survival. They taught me that a garden is both a literal and metaphorical reclamation of space. You take something that's been abandoned or neglected, you invest in it, you make it beautiful, and suddenly, it belongs to you in every way that matters. I run the Eastside Community Garden, 7 acres in South Austin, that had been a vacant lot for 20 years before we claimed it, planted it, turned it into a place where 200 families grow food. It's a sanctuary in a food desert. It's a place where people who don't have wealth can still have agency over what they eat. 3 weeks ago, the city sent an eviction notice. They claimed adverse possession, that we'd been occupying the land without proper legal ownership for too long, and now they had the right to seize it for development. They wanted to build a data center in a neighborhood that doesn't have grocery stores but needs food. I'd been fighting them administratively, through every official channel that existed. I'd gotten nowhere. The city had lawyers. The city had money. The city had the machinery of bureaucracy on their side. Then Hassan Osman showed up at one of our community meetings and said, "I can fight this. I don't know if I'll win, but I can fight." And I fell in love with him approximately 2 minutes into his explanation of Texas property law. Hassan's office was a disaster. Stacks of files, coffee cups in various stages of decomposition, a whiteboard with legal arguments scribbled in 3 different colors. But the moment he started talking about the garden, everything changed. "Property rights in Texas are complicated," he said, clearing a space on his desk for me to sit. "Adverse possession typically requires 10 years of open, notorious occupation. But the statute has been modified. If you can prove continuous use and maintenance, if you can prove community benefit, if you can prove the original owner abandoned the property." "Can we prove that?" I interrupted. "Probably, but we need to prove it by Friday." He looked at me, and something shifted in his expression. "Tell me about the garden." So I did. I told him about my parents. I told him about 200 families who depend on those 7 acres. I told him about Miss Maria, who's 73 and grows tomatoes for her grandchildren. About the Nguyen family, who escaped Vietnam and were able to maintain the plants they grew up with because of our garden. About the kids in the neighborhood who'd never seen food grow before we planted anything. "That's your case," Hassan said quietly. "That's not a legal argument. That's the reason we fight. Can you win? I don't know, but we're going to make them listen." The next 3 days were a study in legal warfare conducted at light speed. Hassan pulled every document related to the land, original ownership records dating back to 1952, abandonment declarations, city correspondence spanning 2 decades. I pulled photographs, testimonies from community members, documentation of everything the garden had produced. We worked in his office until 3 a.m., and then I'd go to the garden and work until sunrise, and then come back to his office at 8 a.m., looking like a disaster. On day 2, Hassan made me coffee without asking how I took it. I drunk it the exact same way the previous morning, and he'd remembered. "Tell me something true," he said, handing me the cup. It was dark roast, no sugar, splash of cream, perfect. "Like what?" "Like why you're really here. You could have hired a different lawyer. You could have given up and let the city develop. Why are you fighting?" I sat down on the only clean chair in his office. "Because my parents came to America for freedom. And freedom, to them, meant the ability to feed themselves, to grow something, to control that one piece of their lives, even when everything else was uncertain." I paused. "The garden isn't just vegetables. It's proof that you can take nothing and make something beautiful, that you can belong somewhere, even if the paperwork says you don't. Hassan was quiet for a moment. My family came from Somalia in 1992. We spent 7 years in a refugee camp in Kenya, 7 years with nothing we could call our own. My parents wanted me to be a doctor, stable, respectable, safe. He set down his coffee. Instead, I became a lawyer, because I kept seeing people get erased by paperwork. People who had legitimate claims but no way to prove them. And I thought if I can learn to read the paperwork, if I can translate it, maybe I can give people back what bureaucracy took. I think we've been talking about the same thing since you walked into my office, Hassan said, and then he kissed me, right there in his disaster of an office, coffee in hand, legal documents scattered everywhere. When he pulled back, he was smiling. I'm probably going to lose if I focus on kissing you instead of preparing the case. Then focus on the case, I said. Kiss me after we win. That's a lot of pressure. You can handle it, I said. You're fighting bureaucracy with intelligence and passion. That's basically a superpower in Austin. The court hearing was Friday morning at 9 a.m. I didn't sleep Thursday night. I sat in the garden instead, walking through the rows. Tomatoes and peppers, and beans and squash, all of it growing in defiance of the city's paperwork. I thought about Hassan in his office, probably not sleeping either, reorganizing his arguments for the 100th time. At 6 a.m. he texted, "Ready?" I responded, "No." "You?" His response came back immediately, "Never, but we're doing this anyway." The courthouse was cold and sterile in a way that made everything feel smaller. The city's lawyer was younger than Hassan, better dressed, representing something with institutional power. Hassan looked like he'd slept in his suit, which he probably had, but when he started talking about adverse possession and community benefit, and the 7 acres that 200 families had transformed, something happened. The judge started taking notes. The city's lawyer started looking less certain. Hassan talked about my parents and Miss Maria and the Nojuen family like they were the most important legal precedent in Texas history. The law, Hassan said, is supposed to serve justice, and justice in this case is recognizing that a community garden is not an invasion of property rights. It's a reclamation of abandoned space for the benefit of people who have nothing else. The judge ruled in our favor. She ruled that 7 years of open, continuous, beneficial use constituted sufficient adverse possession. She ruled that the community benefit documented in photographs and testimonies outweighed the city's development interests. She ruled that the garden was now legally protected. We won in 4 minutes of actual deliberation. Hassan kissed me in the courthouse hallway. Not a careful kiss, not a strategic kiss, a kiss that said we did it. We actually did it. I can't believe we did it. You said you'd kiss me after we won. I reminded him. I'm kissing you now, he said. And then he was kissing me again, and we were both crying, and 200 families had the right to keep their garden. 6 months later, the garden was thriving. We'd expanded it by half an acre once the legal threat was gone. We'd formalized it, actual nonprofit status, which meant funding opportunities, which meant we could hire staff, which meant we weren't just gardeners anymore, we were a social enterprise, creating food security in a food desert. Hassan had become something of a specialist in adverse possession cases. He was taking on other cases, other communities fighting eviction, other gardens fighting development. My case had made him visible in a way he hadn't been before, and we'd moved in together, found a place in South Austin with a yard where Hassan had agreed to let me teach him how to garden. His plants were terrible. He kept forgetting to water them. But he tried, and there was something beautiful about watching a man who understood property law try to understand the patience that gardening required. "Tell me something true," Hassan said one evening, sitting in our yard watching me plant tomato seedlings. "Like what? Like whether you think we're actually going to make it. Because I'm falling in love with you, and I need to know if you're falling too, or if this is just crisis bonding and you're going to leave once the garden is secure." I set down my trowel. "I walked into your office by accident, got the address wrong, but I think that was the first right thing I've done in my life. Finding you was the right thing. That's romantic but not an answer. Okay, I'm in love with you, completely. Like I want to build a life with you, and I want that life to have a garden, and I want you to keep trying to grow tomatoes, even though you're terrible at it, like that." Hassan pulled me close, dirty hands and all. Then we're keeping each other. 1 year later, I proposed in the garden, in the actual garden, at the center of the 7 acres, surrounded by Miss Maria's tomatoes, and the Nguyen family's herbs, and 200 families' reasons to keep fighting. I proposed with a ring made from recycled gold, which Hassan insisted on because he couldn't stand the idea of mining, destroying ecosystems to celebrate our love. He said yes so fast I barely finished the question. The wedding was in the garden. Community members brought food they'd grown. My parents came from Quito, first time they'd left Ecuador in 5 years. Hassan's mother came from Minnesota, his sister from DC. We stood under a pergola covered in climbing beans, and we said vows about belonging and safety, and the specific courage it takes to fight bureaucracy with love. I came to law to fight systems, Hassan said, tears streaming down his face. But I stayed in law because of you. Because you showed me that fighting systems is easier when you're fighting for something beautiful, fighting for you, fighting for this garden, fighting for the spaces where people can belong. I came to gardening because my parents taught me survival, I said. But I stayed in gardening because of you. Because you showed me that survival isn't just about food. It's about having someone who understands why the fight matters. We kissed while 200 people cheered, and the garden grew around us. 2 years later, the East Side Community Garden had become a model. Hassan was consulting with other communities fighting similar cases. We'd started a nonprofit that combined legal aid with community organizing, fighting evictions, challenging adverse possession claims, protecting green spaces in food deserts. We'd adopted a dog, planted an orchard in our yard, and Hassan's tomatoes had actually started growing, which was a minor miracle. We'd learned to work together in ways that weren't crisis-driven, long quiet nights where he'd read case law and I'd catalog plants, existing in companionable silence. The garden, though, the garden was the heart of it. Miss Maria's tomatoes were still producing. The Nguyen family's herbs had expanded. New families had joined. The 7 acres had become a place where people didn't just grow food. They grew community, grew resilience, grew the specific knowledge that they could fight bureaucracy and win. CTF2age. The East Side Community Garden. Timestamp, 1647-33. 2 men stand in the center of 7 acres of growing things. One is pointing at the plants, explaining something. The other is listening intently, hand on the first man's shoulder. Behind them, the garden stretches out. Tomatoes and peppers and beans and squash, all of it growing in defiance of the city's attempts to erase it. In the garden, Miss Maria tends her tomatoes. In the garden, the Nguyen family grows the herbs of home. In the garden, 200 families know they belong. The 2 men are holding hands, and the afternoon sun is catching the recycled gold of their wedding bands, and the garden is proof that fighting bureaucracy with love is a valid strategy.